My name is Margaret Hale. I am 65 years old, and the house you are sitting in tonight belongs to me. I stood at the head of my dining table, my hands resting lightly against the back of a chair, watching my family finish their meal. The dishes were still warm. The smell of roasted chicken and herbs lingered in the air. Someone had poured another glass of wine without asking, the quiet way people do when they feel comfortable, certain they are exactly where they should be. This dinner was supposed to be simple, a small celebration for a new house, a polite, ordinary gathering. That was how I explained it to myself as I folded the napkins earlier that afternoon, trying not to think too hard about why my hands wouldn't stop trembling. My son, Ethan, cleared his throat and pushed his chair back. The legs scraped softly against the floor. He stood up, glass in hand, his expression calm and assured, like a man who believed everything had already been decided. "I want to make a toast," he said. The conversation around the table faded. Forks paused mid-air. My sister lowered her glass slowly, watching him with a cautious look I recognized too well. Ethan smiled and turned slightly toward his wife. "To my wife," he said, "who's moving out tomorrow?" For a moment, no one reacted. The words felt unreal, as if they had been spoken too quickly, without time to fully land. I waited for someone to laugh, to correct him, to ask what he meant. No one did. Across the table, Lauren, my daughter-in-law, leaned back in her chair. She didn't look startled. She didn't look confused. She smiled faintly, confident and unbothered, as if the outcome of this evening had never been in question. I felt something tighten deep in my chest, a slow, steady pressure that had nothing to do with surprise. It was recognition. I didn't speak. I didn't ask Ethan to explain himself. I didn't defend the house, or myself, or the choices that had brought us all to this table. Instead, I slipped one hand into my pocket and wrapped my fingers around my phone. I could feel my pulse beating hard beneath my skin, measured and deliberate. They believed this dinner was a celebration. They had no idea it was the moment I finally decided I would stop staying quiet to keep the peace. After my husband died, the world did not fall apart all at once. It narrowed. Days grew smaller. Decisions felt heavier. People spoke to me gently, as if my grief had softened my edges and weakened my judgment. Richard had handled most things during our marriage, not because I was incapable, but because we had fallen into a rhythm that worked. When he was gone, well-meaning friends offered advice I hadn't asked for. Downsize. Move closer to your son. Don't rush anything. They meant kindness, but every suggestion carried the same quiet message. You are alone now, and alone people shouldn't decide too much on their own. I stayed in our old house for 3 months. I tried. I told myself that if I just gave it time, the walls would stop talking back to me. They didn't. Every corner reminded me of something finished. One morning, standing in the kitchen staring at a sink that no longer held 2 coffee cups, I realized I wasn't healing. I was preserving a life that no longer existed. So I bought the house. It wasn't large or impressive. A single-story place in a quiet neighborhood, with a small backyard and enough light to make the mornings feel possible. I paid for it outright using the insurance money Richard had left me. Signing those papers felt steady, grounding, like placing my feet back on solid ground after weeks of drifting. I told Ethan the same evening. I expected concern, maybe questions. What I wasn't prepared for was the pause on the other end of the phone. "You already bought it?" he asked. "Yes," I said. I needed somewhere that felt like mine. He didn't argue, not directly. He simply went quiet, then told me Lauren would want to see it soon. The words felt harmless enough, but something in his tone unsettled me. It sounded less like interest and more like oversight. Lauren's first visit was polite. Too polite. She complimented the light, the layout, the quiet street. Then she asked how much upkeep a place like this required, if the taxes were high, if I had thought about long-term maintenance. "I'm just thinking ahead," she said, smiling. "It can be a lot for one person." I told myself not to read into it. She was practical, organized. That was how Ethan described her. Still, I noticed how often she glanced around, not the way someone admires a home, but the way someone measures it. After that, the visits became more frequent, always friendly, always framed as help. Lauren brought folders, articles about aging in place, budget worksheets she said might be useful. Ethan started asking questions too, repeating her concerns almost word for word. One evening, he stood in my living room, hands in his pockets, and said, "Mom, we just want to make sure you're protected." Protected from what? He didn't say. That night, after they left, I sat alone on my couch, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I looked around at the walls I had chosen, the furniture I had placed, the space I had claimed for myself, and for the first time since Richard died, I felt something other than grief. I felt uneasy. Not afraid, not angry, just aware that something was shifting slowly and deliberately, and that if I didn't pay attention, I might wake up one day to find that this house and my voice within it were no longer entirely mine. I didn't say any of this out loud. I smiled when they spoke, nodded when it seemed expected, and thanked them for caring. Everything looked normal. A mother adjusting, a son concerned, a daughter-in-law offering support. That was the story anyone would have told if they'd stopped by unannounced. But alone, I began to notice patterns, questions that circled back to money, suggestions that quietly replaced my decisions with theirs, moments when Lauren answered for Ethan before he could speak, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if guiding him. I told myself I was being sensitive. Grief does that, people say. It sharpens emotions and blurs judgment. Still, I started writing things down, not accusations, just dates and phrases, small details I didn't want to forget. Nothing had happened yet. No lines had been crossed, but something was being prepared. I could feel it in the way conversations ended, in the looks that passed between them when they thought I wasn't paying attention there. I went to bed that night knowing one thing clearly. Whatever came next, this house was more than a place to live. It was proof that I was still capable of choosing my own life. And if anyone wanted to take that from me, they would have to do it in the open. The change didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as concern, wrapped in polite questions and gentle suggestions that sounded reasonable on the surface. Lauren began calling more often. Sometimes it was to ask how I was sleeping. Other times it was to remind me about an article she had sent, something about seniors and financial planning, or home safety, or the risks of living alone after 65. She never raised her voice. She never pushed outright. She simply repeated herself, calmly and consistently, until the words started echoing in my own head. Ethan followed her lead without realizing it. When he visited, he walked through the house with his hands clasped behind his back, nodding thoughtfully as if he were inspecting a property rather than stopping by his mother's home. He asked about utility bills, about emergency contacts, about whether I had considered giving someone power of attorney, just in case. "Just in case of what?" I asked once. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Life. Mom." Lauren smiled from the doorway, her expression soft but satisfied. I tried to keep things light. I told them I had neighbors, friends, routines. I reminded Ethan that I had raised him while his father worked long hours, that I had balanced a household and a budget long before spreadsheets and apps existed. He nodded, but his eyes flicked toward Lauren, as if checking whether my answer was acceptable. One afternoon, Lauren arrived unannounced with a small stack of papers tucked under her arm. She said she had been in the area and thought she'd stop by. We sat at the kitchen table while she spread the papers out between us, smoothing them carefully. "These are just options," she said. "Nothing you have to decide today." They weren't contracts, not yet. They were estimates, recommendations, projections, costs of future maintenance, hypothetical scenarios, worst-case outcomes. Everything framed around what might happen if I waited too long to make smart decisions. As she spoke, I watched her closely. The way she controlled the conversation without ever seeming forceful, the way she let silence linger just long enough to make me feel irresponsible for not filling it, the way she used phrases like "we" and "us" when referring to my finances. Ethan came by that evening. Lauren stayed quiet while he spoke, letting him take the lead. It was more effective that way. "We just want to help you stay secure," he said. "This house is a big responsibility." I looked at my son, really looked at him, the boy I had once stayed up all night with when he had the flu, the teenager who had called me first when he got into trouble. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was trying to be a good husband, and in doing so, he was slowly handing my choices over to someone else. That night, after they left, I walked through the house room by room. I turned off lights, locked doors, checked windows. Simple habits, ordinary routines. Yet I found myself wondering how long it would be before someone told me I shouldn't be doing even that alone. The next morning, Lauren called again. Her voice was warm, almost cheerful. "Ethan mentioned you seemed a little defensive yesterday," she said. "We're worried about you, Margaret." Worried. That word carried weight. It implied authority. It suggested that I was already failing some invisible test. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse her of anything. I simply listened. That afternoon, I went to an electronics store and stood in front of a glass case, staring at small digital recorders I had never imagined needing. When the clerk asked if I needed help, I told him it was for taking notes, lectures, personal reminders. He nodded and showed me how it worked. I paid in cash and slipped it into my purse. I didn't feel clever or triumphant. I felt tired. But beneath the exhaustion was something steadier. Clarity. The next time Lauren came over, I turned the recorder on without ceremony. I placed it where it could capture our voices and went about making coffee as if nothing were different. She talked about planning, about efficiency, about how Ethan trusted her judgment. "I'm just trying to make things easier for everyone," she said. I let her speak. I asked questions that sounded naive. I nodded when it seemed appropriate. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, her patience thinned, her tone sharpened just enough to reveal what sat beneath the surface. By the time she left, my hands were shaking. I didn't listen to the recording right away. I wasn't ready to hear my own doubts confirmed. But I knew then that this wasn't about support or family or safety. It was about control. And if I wanted to keep this house and my life inside it, I would need to stop assuming good intentions were enough to protect me. Once I started paying attention, I couldn't stop seeing it. The conversation shifted in small but undeniable ways. Lauren no longer asked what I wanted to do. She told me what would be best. Ethan no longer framed his visits as casual stops. He scheduled them, checking his calendar as if seeing his mother had become another obligation to manage. One evening, he arrived alone. That should have felt like relief, but instead, it made my stomach tighten. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, his shoulders stiff, his hands folded together the way they used to be when he was nervous as a child. "Lauren's been worried," he said. That word again. Worried. He told me they had been talking about the future, about planning, about how unpredictable life could be. His voice sounded rehearsed, as if he had practiced these sentences in advance. "She thinks you might be overwhelmed," he continued. "And honestly, Mom, sometimes I wonder if she's right." The words landed heavier than he seemed to realize. I asked him what exactly made him think that. He hesitated, then said it wasn't one thing. It was a feeling, a pattern, that I seemed resistant to help. Help that I didn't ask for? I said quietly. He frowned, uncomfortable. That's not fair. When he left, I sat at the table long after the sound of his car faded down the street. I replayed the conversation in my head, searching for the moment where concern had turned into judgment. I found it easily. It was the moment he stopped asking me questions and started speaking for me. Lauren came by the next afternoon. She didn't knock. She let herself in, calling my name as if the house already belonged to all of us. I turned the recorder on without thinking this time, my movements calm even as my pulse quickened. She sat down across from me and sighed, the way someone does when they believe patience has been exhausted. "We can't keep going like this," she said. "It's not healthy." "For whom?" I asked. "For Ethan," she replied without hesitation. "He's under so much stress worrying about you." There it was. My existence reframed as a burden. She talked about alternatives, about how living arrangements could change, about how paperwork could make things simpler. Her voice remained smooth, but the words carried an edge I hadn't heard before. "You don't need all this space," she said, glancing around the room. "And managing everything alone at your age isn't ideal." I asked her what she meant by that. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "Sometimes people don't realize when it's time to let others take over." The implication settled between us, heavy and unmistakable. This wasn't about advice anymore. It was about authority. When she left, I locked the door behind her and stood there longer than necessary, my hand still on the knob. My legs felt weak, not from fear, but from the slow realization that I had been walking toward this moment without seeing it clearly. That night, I listened to the recording. I heard her voice, calm and confident, speaking about my life as if it were a project she had already claimed. I heard myself asking careful questions, trying to understand how far she was willing to go. I heard the way she answered, assuming compliance rather than consent. I slept poorly. My thoughts circled endlessly, touching memories I hadn't wanted to revisit, raising Ethan alone when Richard worked late, teaching him independence, trusting that I was building a man who would respect strong women. By morning, exhaustion gave way to resolve. I called Ethan and told him I needed space. He didn't argue, but his silence felt heavy, weighted by someone else's expectations. Lauren texted later that day. Short messages, polite words, underneath them, an unmistakable urgency. She wanted a decision. That was when I understood something that surprised me with its clarity. If I confronted her privately, she would deny everything. If I showed Ethan the recordings alone, he would explain them away. Not because he was cruel, but because believing her version of events was easier than admitting how deeply he had been influenced. The truth needed witnesses. So I invited them both to dinner. I called it a housewarming celebration. I invited my sister, a few cousins, close friends who had known me and Richard for decades, people who understood what this house represented, people who would recognize the difference between concern and control. Lauren agreed immediately. I could hear the satisfaction in her voice, the confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been secured. In the days leading up to the dinner, I moved carefully. I prepared the house. I cooked familiar dishes. I practiced my composure in the mirror, reminding myself that anger would only cloud what needed to be clear. This wasn't about humiliating anyone. It was about reclaiming my voice. On the morning of the dinner, I slipped my phone into my pocket and checked the recordings one last time. My hands were steady. My decision had already been made. By the time the doorbell rang that evening, I felt strangely calm. Whatever happened next, it would happen in the open. By the time everyone arrived, the house no longer felt like just a place I lived in. It felt like a space holding its breath. Coats were placed over chairs. Familiar voices filled the room, and glasses clinked softly as people settled in. The smell of dessert lingered in the air, sweet and warm, contrasting sharply with the tension I felt beneath my calm exterior. Lauren moved easily among the guests, smiling, thanking people for coming, accepting compliments about the house as if they belonged to her. Ethan stayed close to her, his posture relaxed, his hand resting lightly at her back. He looked like a man who believed everything was finally under control. I watched them quietly. Whatever fear had lived inside me for weeks had faded into something steadier. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shaking. I was ready. Dinner ended, and conversation slowed naturally. Ethan pushed his chair back and stood, lifting his glass with a practiced confidence that made my chest tighten. "I just want to say how grateful I am," he began. "This house has brought our family closer together." He paused, then smiled toward Lauren. "And I'd like to toast my wife," he said, "who's moving out tomorrow." The room went still. I heard a sharp intake of breath from across the table. Someone shifted uncomfortably in their chair. No one raised a glass. Lauren smiled faintly, her expression composed, almost indulgent. She believed the decision had already been made, that this moment belonged to her. I stood slowly, the sound of my chair scraping against the floor cutting through the silence. "Before we continue," I said, my voice calm and even, "there's something I need everyone to hear." Ethan turned toward me, confusion flickering across his face. "Mom?" I raised my hand gently. Not in anger, just enough to stop him. I placed my phone on the table and pressed play. Lauren's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable, calm, confident, speaking about plans I had never agreed to, about decisions made without me, about how Ethan trusted her judgment completely. No one spoke. When the recording stopped, Lauren stood abruptly. "That's taken out of context," she said quickly. "Margaret, you had no right to record me." "There's more," I replied, and pressed play again. This time, there was no ambiguity. Her voice spoke of control, of paperwork, of how things would be easier once I stopped resisting, once I understood my place. Ethan's face drained of color. "Lauren?" he said quietly. She turned to him, her tone softening. "You know I was only trying to help. You know how stressed you've been about your mother." I stopped the recording. "No," I said. "You were trying to decide my life for me." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Ethan lowered his glass and looked at her, then at me, as if seeing both of us clearly for the first time. "Is this true?" he asked. Lauren hesitated. That hesitation told him everything. "Is it?" he asked again, his voice breaking. She straightened her shoulders. "I was doing what needed to be done." Ethan set his glass down carefully. His hands were shaking. "You need to leave," he said. Her eyes widened. "What?" "Tonight," he replied. "Not tomorrow." Lauren looked around the room, searching for support. She found none. Faces that had once smiled politely now held disbelief, disappointment, and quiet judgment. She grabbed her purse and walked toward the door without another word, The door closed behind her with a final, hollow sound that echoed through the house. No one spoke for a long moment. Ethan sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. I went to him and rested my hand on his shoulder. He didn't pull away. "I didn't see it," he said softly. "I should have seen it." "You see it now," I said. "That's enough." The evening ended quietly. People hugged me, thanked me, offered support without asking questions. One by one, they left until the house was still again. Later that night, I stood alone in my living room. The same space where I had once doubted myself now felt solid beneath my feet. I hadn't played those recordings to punish anyone. I played them because silence had already cost me too much. Keeping the peace is not the same as preserving your dignity, and this house, and the life I built inside it, would remain mine.